Swami Kriyananda emphasized and urged us to enjoy and participate in music is not only for the beauty of music and the fact that it opens the heart. I'm talking now more about the choirs, because naturally we have music where we're chanting or we're just inwardly singing to God or whatever. All of those things are uplifting. But a choir requires that people tune in to the people around them. You have to keep your note while still listening to the notes of the others. And when the voices can blend together like that, it creates a kind of a harmony, literally a harmony of vibrations. And learning how to produce that harmony of vibrations helps us to harmonize our vibrations with the deep vibration of God. So this class series that we're going to give of 3 classes is on Paramahansa Yogananda's techniques for accelerating our spiritual growth. And we're going to break it into 3 parts. So tonight we're going to talk about the techniques that he brought and the importance of that. Next week we will talk about attitudes that he suggested that we develop. And then on the final class in 2 weeks, we will talk about the lifestyle that he suggested that we lead in order to accelerate our spiritual evolution, really. The thing that we're all seeking is a return to the original state that we came from and that we all possess within ourselves. So we all came from God as an extension of God's consciousness. Lahiri Mahashaya described it this way, that God represents pure bliss, pure consciousness, pure existence. He didn't say that alone. That was Adi Shankara who gave that definition for God, Satchidananda. But Lahiri expanded on that some and said that God, in his pure state of pure consciousness, resides in that. And in the stillness, see, we're used to restlessness, we're used to activity, we're used to the energy that we receive coming through the senses. And so there's, in the world of creation, everything is in flux. Everything is created only by duality. But coming back, so God resides in that still state. And the way Lahiri put it was that he takes 1% of his consciousness and manifests it outwardly. And so that still prana is the perfect, one could say, state of God. But then, for whatever his reasons, and we might at times of difficulty question why in the world he wanted to make creation in the first place, but whatever his reasons, he does. In fact, I'll speak a little bit more seriously. I don't want to leave that just hanging. Swami Kriyananda gave a beautiful explanation of it. He said that it is the very nature of joy to want to share itself. And so, just as light, it's the nature of light to expand and to travel and to move. It's the nature of water to be in wave motion. It's the nature of joy to want to expand. And so that expansion of joy, God wanted to have the enjoyment of consciousness, because it's all about consciousness. So he wanted to have the enjoyment of consciousness and of self-awareness to be present in multiple locations, not just in one location. So the expansion of joy is really the reason for creation. So God creates the universe, an outward universe, by taking that still prana, as Lahiri called it, and making it dynamic or putting it into motion. And so at the fundamental basis of creation is vibration. And it can be expressed as Om, it can be expressed as light, it can be expressed as positive and negative charges in the very atoms that make up all of creation. There are multiple ways that this duality expresses itself, but basically it is always a movement of two poles, so polarizing. So if you take a tuning fork and you tap it, it moves back and forth between the farthest point here and the farthest point there. If you hit a guitar string, it does the same thing. In a wave-like motion, it moves up and down to the highest point and the lowest point. And so all of creation is this based upon this duality. Now we are essentially just God. We're always God, because what else could we be? There is nothing else in all of existence except God. But we're God in the dynamic form of prana, and part of the duality of the dynamic form of prana is that each individual in that multiple universe, multiple enormous creation, each point at its center seems unique and seems to be the center of the whole universe. Master said something very interesting. He said, from a deep state of samadhi, I perceived that the center of the entire universe was a point of perception, intuitive perception, in my own heart. Now, it isn't that he was unique and he was the only point at which the center of the universe was. It's that everyone is the center of the universe. We think, generally speaking, in two dimensions. And so if you have a plate, there is one point on that plate, a flat plate, one point that's the center of that plate. And so you can put a dot there, and anywhere else you put the dot, it can't be the center of that plate. But if you take a balloon, so that makes it 3 dimensions instead of 2 dimensions, you put a dot on that balloon, and it's the center of the whole circumference, isn't it? But then you put a dot on the other side, and it too is the center. And no matter how many dots you put, they're all the center. And so no matter how many souls God creates, each one is the center of the entire universe. And so each of us is an extension of God, and we are one could say, the center of the universe of dynamic prana that he has created. Now, because in that creation outwardly, there seems to be separate individual points, we have the consciousness that we're separate from each other. Now, on a deep level, on a soul level, that's our egoic consciousness. On a soul level, we know that we're just part of everything that is. And so within us is a kind of a dynamic tension where the ego recognizes that something's wrong with this picture. You know, we're born, we grow up in a certain culture, we learn certain skills, certain languages, all of the things that we learn, but we have the sense that we are separate from everybody else. Master said that the definition of the ego is the soul that's become identified with the body and the personality. And so it has to do, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, it has to do with the way that that dynamic prana, that is what God uses to create the universe, how that functions in us. And so the fact that that dynamic prana in our body has an outward, remember I was saying there's a vibration, a high point and a low point in our spine. There's a high point and a low point. And that dynamic prana in not our physical spine, in our subtle spine, is moving from between the base of the spine to the point here at the medulla and back down. And it moves like that. And it moves like that from the moment that you're born and you take your first breath, because your first inhalation is the accompaniment of that upward movement. It reaches its top, and then it begins to descend, and you exhale. And so your entire life is spent with that movement up and down in the spine of the dynamic prana, not of the physical breath. But the physical body is formed from that dynamic prana, and I won't go into it too much because we need to move on to techniques and the importance of them. But what I want to establish as kind of the foundation is that within us is that dynamic tension between the ego and the soul. And so the ego feels uncomfortable. Even though things are good, things are bad, maybe things are wonderful for a lifetime or 2 lifetimes, still everybody who's born feels like I was made for something more than the life that I find myself in. There's got to be more to it than this. And so that desire for something more gradually drives us, because what it really is it's the attraction of our soul nature that consciously knows the still state of God. It's the attraction of that soul nature to the egoic nature pulling it. And so it's the tension within us, it's not outside. It's all just consciousness. And so within us is that desire for something more and something more. And first we try to find that by seeking it outside of ourselves. We think, I need something more. I need more money. And I'll be happy if I'll be satisfied, I'll be fulfilled if I have more money. And we go through hundreds and hundreds of different, I'll be happy if only I have, and then you fill in the blank, and it could be 100 different ways, 1,000 different ways that you fill in the blank. But there's always, forget the blank, there's always the I will be happy if. And that I will be happy if drives us toward evolution. And so seeking that happiness, seeking that contentment, that fulfillment that is ours by natural right because we're part of God. Seeking that is what drives the soul's evolution. Birth after birth after birth after birth. Seeking first outwardly and then gradually more and more realizing that I'm not going to find it outside of myself. And so finally when we go through enough experiences, Master put it this way, he said, the soul reaches a point where it feels an anguishing monotony with this, I will be happy if. And that causes the incarnation. Well, however you fill in the blank, that's what your incarnation is going to be dedicated toward. The soul gets to a point where that concept is an anguishing monotony because we've done it so many, many times and never found ultimate fulfillment that we're after. And so gradually we get to the point where we say there has to be something more than this, and there has to be a way to find it. And that's what Patanjali started out his Yoga Sutras with, because when we get to that state, he said, and now we come to the study of the science of yoga. And so after we're finally ready, we finally ask the question, how can I get out of this paradigm of seeking things outside of myself? And so when we're ready to ask that question, then we're ready for the science of yoga. And the science of yoga is essentially the dispensing of the delusion that not only does happiness lie outside of ourselves, because we've kind of already figured that one out, that's why we're studying yoga, but that there is anything outside of myself. And so what we're trying to get to is the state of self-realization, to realize that there is no anything outside of myself, because I am all that is, everything that is in existence. That doesn't mean that the ego can say that. See, the ego keeps us from knowing that. But the soul can say that, because the soul unites with God. And that's what we're after, that state of self-realization or ultimate expansion of our consciousness. But then we have to ask the question of, okay, now that I understand that that's what I want, how? That's what yoga is all about. Yoga is the how. Vedanta is the what, Sankhya is the why, and yoga is the how. Three of the great systems of Indian thought. Now, one of the things, once you embark on the path of yoga, one of the things that is extremely important, and this is a difference between a path of yoga and, let's say, a religion or a belief system, is that the path of yoga gives you techniques for the achievement of that state of expanded consciousness. A belief system can motivate you to want it, can help you a little bit, but it can't give you the answers. Because a belief system, again, ties you to something outside of yourself. You don't create the belief system. Your parents give it to you, the culture gives it to you, something outside of yourself gives it to you, and you accept that for your own, but it's like hand-me-down clothing. It never, ever quite fits. And so you might, in fact, the fanatics of the world are not the true believers, they're the true doubters. That's why they're fanatics, is because they know that whatever they're believing in doesn't seem to fulfill anything, and therefore they've got to proclaim it more and more desperately, and they're so insecure that they've got to have everybody else proclaim it too. And so fanatics are not true believers, they're true doubters. And so, but for us, what we're after now is the question of how do we achieve that state of consciousness that we're after. And as Patanjali says, and now we come to the study of the science of yoga, and as our path says, okay, now you're ready for the practice of techniques, because I'm going to offer you techniques which will allow you to achieve the state of consciousness. And here's the pathway, and it's one pathway, all of the techniques kind of coming together. If you take an overview of the techniques, they're all basically about the same thing. We're trying to achieve two conditions that will allow us to perceive ourselves as we truly are, as opposed to perceive ourselves as the ego. The first is we're trying to achieve a stillness of mind or a stillness of consciousness. Because when the consciousness is stillness is the, one could say, the true God, and the dynamic restless state is God in the restless state. So if we're going to reunite beyond creation, we have to achieve absolute stillness. And so the techniques that we have are meant to allow us and help us to achieve a still state of consciousness. So that stillness of consciousness, when we perceive that, when we achieve that, we will automatically perceive ourselves as God or as everything. As Patanjali put it, when we still the vibrations or the whirlpools of restless likes and dislikes, or the feeling nature, the primordial feeling nature, Master defined it, when we can still that, we automatically achieve the state of yoga. We don't have to learn it. We don't have to study anything. We don't have to have a belief system. People who've never heard of yoga, if they achieve the stillness, go into the state of yoga. People from all cultures and all times have these experiences. And so we're trying to achieve that. Now, the techniques, the beauty of the techniques is that finally we have a way that we can do something, that we can have a practice, a discipline, a means of achieving that state. And so stillness of consciousness is what we're after, and that is going to require several conditions to achieve. The first is that because if our minds are functioning outward through the senses in themselves are not only restless, not only keep the mind restless, but they give us a completely false picture of reality. We think that we see clearly reality, but the senses don't give us the true picture of reality. Only intuition can give us that. And so we have to withdraw our energy from the senses, and that requires learning how to get in touch with our energy, with our prana. And so the basic techniques of our path all help us to first get a feel for and get in touch with the prana, and secondly to control it, not just in order to control it for no purpose, but to control it because by withdrawing it from outward direction into the spine and then lifting it up to the point between the eyebrows brings us into the still state. Lahiri, again, I was saying about the, God being 99% still prana and 1% dynamic prana. He said that in our chakras, only this point, and by extension, then Master said we first have to get to this point, and then the energy can get to the crown chakra. But only at this point is the vibration, the rate of prana, still enough for our consciousness to be able to perceive ourselves as we truly are. So you might say that the whole of our path is getting in touch with prana, getting the ability to see it, not see it, but feel it, to withdraw it, and to lift it up. And so the techniques that Master gave us for that are the energization techniques, or technique of energization, which by daily practice and by concentrating, see, it's hard to do it just internally. So Master gave us the technique of energization so that we could, through physical and movement, tense and relax, we could send this prana and withdraw it and begin to feel the flow of that prana. And when we can get in touch and begin to feel it and direct it to and from various body parts, then when we sit for meditation, we can also direct that prana to withdraw and to come up the spine. And so energization and then Hong Sa, the 4 basic techniques of our path. We have many techniques, but the basic ones are energization, Hong Sa, the Om technique, and of course Kriya Yoga. And so those 4 techniques, through energization, we get to feel this prana, the dynamic prana. Through Hong Sa, we withdraw it. Remember what I was saying about the movement of the breath as being, that's what creates the restlessness in us? Hong Sa helps us to stop, or at least lessen the movement of the breath. And that allows us to concentrate. And when we are able to concentrate and hold our mind with deep concentration for some period of time, then we will become still enough so that we will go into a state of yoga. And I'll just end with this thought, that we think that the mind is really important, that the brain is the way that we are able to think, that we're able to perceive. The brain could better be seen as an inhibiting device for consciousness rather than that which creates consciousness. Consciousness exists outside of the body, outside of the brain. Your consciousness exists outside of the body, outside of the brain. But it's hard to function in this world in that state until you gradually accustom to it. So the brain inhibits the awareness of that rather than creates that. And so we need to still the mind through these techniques, concentrate it, hold it in a still state for a long enough period of time, and when we accomplish those conditions, we will go into the state of yoga. But yoga gives us the techniques that allow that to happen.